Spirit of Texas, the Karankawa. One of the first tribes to be encountered by the Spanish explorers when they began journeying into what would become Texas was the Karankawa. Sometimes friendly, sometimes fierce, they were said to occasionally practice cannibalism. Often smelly, they covered their bodies with alligator grease to keep away the mosquitoes. And now extinct, this fascinating group acted as one of our state's first greeting committees and hosts. The Karankawa lived along the lower Gulf Coast land on the barrier islands from Galveston down to Corpus Christi. Their environment included flat prairies, marshlands, some woodland areas, and of course the coastlands and bays. The bands would rarely travel inland more than 100 miles, although as nomads they moved frequently to find available food and better protection from bad weather. Since this tribe lived near the Gulf and wetlands, dugout canoes were invaluable forms of transportation. These canoes were made from tree trunks, hollowed out through a technique of burning and scraping. Each boat was big enough for an entire family and their provisions. Instead of oars, long poles pushed the canoes through the shallow waters. The life of a nomad requires homes easy to pick up and move quickly. A stay in one camp might only last a few weeks. The Karankawa huts were created with 18-foot-long willow poles, placed in a circle and connected at the top. These wigwams were then at least partially covered with animal skins to keep out the elements, but open enough to let out the smoke from fires built in the center of the home. Baskets and clay pottery, waterproofed with tar that had washed ashore, were used for gathering and cooking. Most meals were cooked in these clay pots and heated on glowing coals. Oysters were merely thrown into the fire, as the heat caused the shell to pop open ready to eat. Their Karankawa were often turned to the same areas, and the discovery of shell middens gave clues as to which were their favorite campsites. These middens were refuse piles built up year after year by the Native Americans, who would return during their travels and pile their leftovers and rubbish in the same place during their occupation of that particular spot. The Karankawa were hunter-gatherer-fishers, and so they hunted and ate meat, gathered edible plants, plant roots, nuts, and berries, and fished in the many available wetlands and shores of the Gulf coastal region. They hunted deer, bear, birds, and javelina when close to their shore. During their inland journeys, they would hunt bison as well. Fish and shellfish were popular, and meals retrieved from the water included turtles, clams, oysters, scallops, porpoises, and even alligators. As mentioned earlier, these alligators were not only good to eat, but they also provided a natural smelly mosquito repellent, which was smeared all over the Karankawa's bodies. Oysters served as a main source of food until spring. After that, blackberries provided the bulk of their diet. As the weather and available food sources changed with the seasons, the Karankawa would move between the mainland shore and the islands and sandbars. During times when food was scarce, the tribe was also known to eat locusts and bear fat. They were just happy to have food. Even spoiled food and raw meat were part of their diet. The Karankawa were known for their long red cedar bows, which were almost as tall as the men themselves. Bowstrings, often created by twisting fine deer sinew, and arrows were devised with 3 feathers attached. Amazingly, this tribe not only hunted with their bows and arrows, they also fished with them. Capturing seafood occurred throughout the use of traps and fishhooks made from shells as well. Other common tools used by the Karankawa included lances, clubs, and tomahawks. The Karankawa were unusually tall compared to the other tribes found in Texas. The men stood at least 6 feet and were strong and muscular. They wore little clothing other than moccasins and a breechcloth, sometimes accompanied with a long fringed sash. The women wore skirts made from animal skins and Spanish moss, at times covering their shoulders with moss shawls. Ornaments included bracelets, necklaces, anklets, and feathers placed in their hair. Both the men and women painted and tattooed their bodies, often piercing their lower lip with a piece of cane. As scary as their appearance may have been, people who encountered the Karankawa said when food was plentiful and the Indians were not threatened, the people were generous and happy. They led a difficult lifestyle and had to be strong to withstand the hunger and the cold of winter. Although much of their time was spent hunting, gathering, and moving, the Karankawa found time for other activities as well. These strong men were physically competitive and loved contests to test their strength in wrestling, swimming, knife throwing, arrow shooting, and running. While the men hunted and competed, the women erected and took down the huts, gathered wood, cooked, and picked edible vegetables. These tribe members, while appearing quite fearsome, were very fond of their children. Babies were strapped and carried on cradle boards when they were young, but began to hunt or help their mothers at an early age. Children were given two names. One was a nickname only used by outsiders, and the other was considered a magical secret name. When the time came for the child to transition into adulthood, a shaman performed a ceremony, which included the application of tattoos. Other religious ceremonies included mitotes, where circle dancing was performed with music provided by tortoiseshell or gourd tambourine accompaniment. Each band of Karankawa had a chief. One pioneer reported that the men painted their faces when on the warpath, half red and half black. Smoke signals were used to communicate in both times of war and also to send messages about social events. Although the Karankawa lived a relatively quiet life, their influence and mark on Texas history is significant. When Spanish explorers were stranded during a shipwreck in the Galveston area, it is believed a tribe of Karankawa rescued Cabeza de Vaca and the other castaways, ensuring their survival but also enslaving the Spaniards. Finally, Cabeza de Vaca and his men escaped and made their way to Mexico. Their stories of life with the Karankawa resulted in an invaluable record of the world of these fascinating Native Americans. The Karankawa made contact with the Europeans through the introduction of French traders in the 1600s. When Spanish missions were established in the following century, the Karankawa refused to participate, but chose instead to continue their nomadic lifestyle, irritating many of their new neighbors. Trouble continued in the early 1800s with settlers and Mexican troops, and by the mid-1850s these tribes had completely disappeared. These intriguing Indians either became ill and died from disease, often brought to America by explorers, or were victims of battles with other tribes and settlers.